Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Sides, and this course is Principles of Macroeconomics, Chapter 12, or it would be Chapter 25 in the combination book, Production and Growth. This chapter studies the variables which determine quantities and output. We also look at the variables that affect economies' long-run real growth and GDP. When we talk about growth, we do so in terms of rates. The most popular is real GDP. In chapters 23 and 24, we discussed, or 10 and 11, we discussed the cost of living expenses and income. Cost of living being CPI, Consumer Price Index, and income being GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, for an entire economy. Remember that GDP includes consumption. Now, in Chapter 25 or Chapter 12, we discuss how the goods and services we purchase are produced and how our purchases and productions help the economy grow. This slide and the following two slides are pictorial representations of GDP and CPI for first world, second world, and third world countries. We call first world countries developed nations, and we call second and third world countries developing or emerging economies. As you will see, this is a typical first world. GDP per capita, GDP per person, 36,000. Life expectancy, they expect to live 80 years, and 99% of the citizens in this first world country are literate, meaning that they can read and write. This is considered a second or developing nation. The GDP per capita or per person is 14,270,000 a year. They can expect to live about 76 years, and 86% of the population can read and write. And in that was a second world. This is a third world country. In this third world country, GDP per person is $1,090. Life expectancy is 52 years of age, and only 46% of the adults can read or write. So as you can see, as you move from a less developed nation to a more developed nation, you can see some correlations in terms of GDP per capita or per person. And you see that life expectancy also increases from 56 to 80 years. And then adult literacy, whether or not adults 15 years of age or older can read and write, and it moves from 46% to 99%. And to give you context and for comparison purposes, in the United States, our GDP per capita is $46,900. Our life expectancy is 78.2 years, and we have also a 99% adult literacy rate. This lecture and this series of lectures will take a three-step approach to this chapter. First, we will examine international data on GDP per person or GDP per capita. Second, we will examine productivity. And then the third is to consider the link between productivity and economic policies. A nation's standard of living is determined by how productive its citizen workers are. And as we can see here, is our incomes and growth from around the world, GDP per capita or per person in 2009, and then the growth rate from 1970 to 2009. When we measure growth, we measure it by how rapid real GDP per person grows in a typical year. And as you can see, we see that some countries grow faster than other countries. And that here, the United States is pretty much in the middle in terms of growth. I want you to pay particular attention to the top three, China, Singapore, and India. And we're going to talk about this more in depth later. But one of the reasons why we're seeing this vast rise in growth is due to something that we call the catch-up effect. And we'll speak more to that later on in the lecture, but I want you to pay attention to it now because I will refer back to it in the future lectures. This concludes the first segment of our lecture on production and growth. Again, we took a look at the international step one to examine the international data of GDP per person. And in our subsequent lectures, we're going to examine productivity, and then we're going to also consider the link between economic policies and productivity. I look forward to speaking to you soon.